What is up? Welcome to another edition of the Fantasy Life Podcast. I am Marcus Grant, joined by Dwain McFarland, and here we are, Dwain. We have made it to week 17. This is the championship week for so many of us. I know for best ball folks in these higher stakes leagues, you've been sort of in this mode for a while, but for a lot of people, this is it. This is do or die. This is make or break. So we appreciate you guys hanging in there with us and listening. If you somehow are not in a championship and you're listening, we thank you for that as well. But Dwain, no pressure. We just got to figure out a week's worth of chaos and some stars that maybe are struggling and try to help people win titles. No big deal.
Yeah, the NFL season is always chaos. I don't know that I remember one, though, where there was so much craziness right at the end. And a lot of the chaos can be packed into the last few weeks because certain teams, they're done. Other teams, for different reasons, right? Some are done just because they're done and they've really just been done because, they haven't been very good and they start shutting players down. Other teams, they have already clinched their playoff spot. And so that creates a unique scenario. But then there's these added layers this year, the Jaguars and Titans. It's not even about this week. You're ending your fantasy championship, on the week you're supposed to, before the last week of the season when a lot of teams rest their guys. And guess what? This random event comes up where, neither one of these teams this week doesn't matter. They just need to be healthy for next week because they play each other and whoever wins is in. So just the randomness of that, the weather that we've had over the last 2 weeks, the quarterback roulette that has been going on, just spin the wheel. The quarterback is the position that impacts everything. When you lose Kyler Murray, then you lose Colt McCoy and you're starting Trace McSorley. Guess what? Your DeAndre Hopkins shares, your Marquise Brown shares. It doesn't matter. They can be the best players in the world, but it's Dunsky for those guys. So I don't know. Do you remember a time where there's been so much packed into these 2 weeks, especially, right? And now going into this third week where it's so important?
Yeah, no, I really don't. And I always feel like when we have these conversations that we're sort of prisoners of the moment.
I agree.
I this does seem a little bit bizarre, right? And you mentioned that oddity between the Jaguars and the Titans, where week 17, whatever happens for those teams in week 17 has no bearing over their playoff lives. So we saw the Titans basically put everybody who was even slightly nicked up. If you got the sniffles, you probably aren't going to play against the Cowboys because they need everybody ready for week 18. Whereas the Jaguars seem to have taken the opposite tack. Doug Peterson saying, we're not resting anybody. We're going into this because every game matters. So it is really, really weird. And like you said, we're doing it the right way, right? Everybody's finishing in week 17. We're not playing week 18 championships, and you're still maybe coming in there with one hand tied behind your back. So we will do what we can to kind of help you out here. We'll go through the rankings, which you can check out at fantasylife.com. We'll also talk at the end of the show about some big name players who maybe haven't been playing up to their reputations recently and whether or not you would feel comfortable sitting them in championship week. But let's start where you talk about playoff seedings and what teams, are still available or are still viable here at the end of the season. And a lot of teams maybe tapping out. One of them appears to be the Las Vegas Raiders because they made the announcement on Wednesday that Derek Carr would not play the final 2 games of the season. Instead, they're going to turn to Jarrett Stidham. So here you are going into championship week. It was already going to be a tough matchup, Dwayne, for guys like Devontae Adams and Josh Jacobs going against the 49ers. Now they're not going to have their starting quarterback with them. I know we're going to talk, some of these big names that sort of at the end of the show, but this is a major downgrade for both these guys in the worst possible week for fantasy managers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially for Adams, and he had really been on a downward turn over the last several weeks anyway. This offense went from really kind of clicking on all cylinders for a short period. And we see this, teams get hot, just like a baseball hitter gets hot, whether it's due to matchups or just, certain things that happen to come together for a short moment in a season. And a lot of times this can go back to health and things like that as well. For whatever reason, that has turned the other way over the last couple of weeks. And we've really seen, Adams struggle. We've seen Jacob struggle. And now you have the worst matchup of all matchups, like the 49ers. It's one we really care about. We talk about a lot of times, there's the bell curve. There's a lot of the teams that are kind of in the middle on either side, right, of that, perfect, middle distribution, and we're not that worried about those. The ones that are inside like that 65%, right, of all teams. But it's the outliers that we care about that can be good or bad as far as matchups go. This is one of those outliers. You don't want to mess around with the 49ers defense. It doesn't matter what position you play. It's bad. It's really bad. And now having Stidham against the 49ers, like, man, I don't know. Like there's a chance the Raiders score 3 points in this game. Like it could just be that bad. So it's clear that winning the game is not necessarily. It's obviously not the priority. The coaching staff, they're all going to do what they can, right, to get their team ready to go compete. It's just going to be major struggle bus though for these two guys this weekend. I moved Devontae Adams down to wide receiver 8. He's usually in the top 3. I'll be honest, I don't know that I've moved him far enough, Marcus, and I know we can talk about that some later. Josh Jacobs, I did also downgrade. Now Jacobs, like, he still had all the workload. Nothing has changed with what Jacobs has been, as far as like his utilization. Like it's all still there, but the efficiency has gone down. We did note that he had multiple bad matchups in a row. Some of them were kind of more borderline. We wouldn't be worried maybe just in a one-off week, but this one is definitely one we would be worried about with the 49ers. And it just so happened that really all of those matchups have gone bad for him over the last couple of games. And I don't know, like with Jacobs, really the ceiling for him comes from touchdowns. And I just don't see a path to touchdowns this weekend against, the 49ers. I mean, and look, you are the local 49ers expert. Like, do you see any upside for Josh Jacobs? Like, I think you would be lucky to score 1 touchdown.
Yeah, not for Josh Jacobs.
Yeah.
I mean, look, we are praising Brian Robinson because he ran for 58 yards against the 49ers, right? Because that's been one of the better rushing outputs against that defense all year long. And now you got Jarrett Stidham there. And, I've seen people sort of joking, maybe half joking, that the Raiders might not cross midfield against this defense. I just don't see a big path for Josh Jacobs here. Then you also worry if game script becomes an issue. Or is it just the Raiders just say, we're just going to stick with our game plan because we don't expect much anyway. But I could see a situation where in the second half, if the Niners can score some points, Jacobs is not even getting opportunities really, but the chance for him scoring a touchdown seems remote. I mean, I would say maybe weirdly the outlook for Devontae Adams is a little bit better just because the Niners will give up some plays occasionally in the passing game. They are known to, maybe let an occasional guy kind of get behind them once in a while. So maybe that happens for Adams. I mean, I think we saw it last week with guys like Jahan Dotson and a little bit with Terry McLaurin. But Josh Jacobs is a scary, scary proposition. Like I said, we'll talk about later some guys that you might consider sitting. Josh Jacobs is very much on the list, and what you decide to do with him is probably going to be kind of up to you once you get to the weekend.
Question is Stidham. Like, is Stidham Trace McSorley?
Right.
Like, we don't know. We just don't know. We do not know
don't.
a lot about Jarrett Stidham as far as his game in the NFL.
We don't.
Like, so we don't know where he is on the spectrum. I'm assuming it's pretty bad.
We're going to learn in real time, which probably doesn't help a whole lot of people. I mean, just sort of looking, he has in 3 seasons thrown 61 career passes, completed 32 of them, 2 touchdowns, 4 picks. That doesn't tell you much. He's never started a game, so
it's not good.
Yeah, so we're gonna all learn together what Jarrett Stidham is exactly. Mention the Jaguars though, because they say they're not going to rest any starters this week against the Houston Texans. Doug Peterson saying they are playing to win every single game. It's admirable, especially for people who've been starting, whether it's Trevor Lawrence, Christian Kirk, Zay Jones, Travis Etienne, Evan Ingram, all those guys who've been so good for us down the stretch. That's great for us. But Dwayne, this also feels sort of like a coach of a young team. Sort of wanting this team to keep the momentum and keep the faith in themselves. I mean, it feels as much psychological as it does sort of on field with Peterson making this decision.
Yeah. It's one of these decisions that a coach makes that, if someone does get hurt, like I feel bad for him. Like he's gonna get torched by all the media. But I agree. I think, and they're on a roll. Look, this is a team that's kind of struggled most of the season, and they've just now hit their stride. So I do believe there is something to that, right? Once you have that mojo and you've kind of bottled it up and you've got it, it's like you don't want to lose it again. Like you want to keep it going. So if you're a team more like the Eagles, and I mean that's not the best example because they're really close to clinching the number 1 seed. But if you've been good all year, kind of being my point, I think, maybe resting at the end of the year, there's a lot you can rest on, right? You can be like, look, guys, we were awesome all season. The Jaguars really have just gotten hot over the last month. And so I think keeping everything rolling is probably the right decision. Obviously, if Trevor Lawrence were to get hurt, Christian Kirk, Zay Jones, someone like that, Travis Etienne, even like if one of those guys got hurt, that would probably cost you more, right, than the momentum that you might lose. But I get it. And I mean, it's injuries are always a risk, in football. You could get hurt in practice, practicing for the week, even if you don't play the game. So I'm with Doug Peterson. Obviously for fantasy managers, we love it. We want to see them play because they play the Texans. So if you have Travis Etienne and you've lived through, this is a guy that got hot in the middle of the season. He's lived through a bit of a drought over the last several games. But if you've managed to fight your way into your playoff, championship, or, you're over in Best Ball Mania and you've made it this far, any of these big contests, like there's not a better matchup that you could have. You're going to get to play against the team that gives up the most rushing yards per game, on the ground, 166 and non-overtime to be 166. I mean, how's this even possible? I mean, in a league where, if you can get 100 yards on the game, rushing, 110 yards is really good. Like they give up 166. So it's pretty bad. 33.5 rushing attempts per game. So this just sets up really good for ETN on the passing game side. Like it also sets up really well. I mean, the Jaguars are probably going to lead, a lot of the game. This line is kind of weird. I don't know if it's moved, but I think a lot of it was predicated on Vegas not knowing if the Jaguars would potentially rest starters, right? They're only 4-point favorites unless that line's moved this morning. This was yesterday evening when I pulled down the data last. But as far as Trevor Lawrence goes, like, yeah, the Texans don't give up a ton of yards passing, but efficiency, it's all there for the taking. Like this is still one of the worst graded, defenses as far as PFF coverage grades go, 53.4. So that's the fourth worst in the league. So you may not need to throw the ball the whole time, but it's a team that you could easily look up and be like, wow, we have 300 yards and we only threw the ball 27 times. We also have 150 yards on the ground. So it's a really good thing. I'm going to treat these guys. Interested in your thoughts. I do think there's a chance like, they could rest them later in the game, especially if the game's really in hand. You might not get the absolute extreme blow up stats from a guy like ETN because you could easily see if they're up by 14 in the fourth quarter, why play him? Especially at this point of the year, but can still do a ton of damage in the first three quarters. So I'm going to treat these guys normally for the most part, and really close tiebreakers. I might lean the other way on some of these decisions, but overall going to treat the Jags the same.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would too. And I think what's also factoring in for me is that the last few weeks, the Texans have been feisty. I mean, they got the win last week against Tennessee. but they hung in with Kansas City, gave them problems. They gave the Cowboys problems. So, the record might not show well in wins and losses, but you watch the way they've played over the last few weeks. They have not laid down for anybody. So I think that's going to very much be in play this week. So I think the Jaguars win, but I don't necessarily think they just run away with this thing just because the Texans, have not been a pushover necessarily the last few weeks. So I think that definitely helps. Niners and Vikings still have something to play for. The 1 seed seems improbable for both of those teams just because the Eagles only need to win once. And if they win early this weekend, then it's not going to matter for the Niners and the Vikings. But the 2 seed's still very much up for grabs. So in terms of sitting players there, I don't expect the Vikings or the 49ers to rest anybody because getting that 2 seed and having home field advantage for as long as you possibly can is still incredibly important. So I would think that for players on those teams, you can sort of treat them as normal this week as well, correct?
Yeah, I agree. I saw it was like early yesterday. There was some stuff on social media just kind of floating around about, wow, San Francisco, Minnesota could be a problem. No, I don't think it will be. I do think the 2 seed is definitely worth playing for, keeping that home field advantage to your point. And, there's a chance like, especially if the Eagles do lose in the early window, like that would definitely, help the situation. But I don't think it's necessary. Even if the Eagles win, that 2 seed is enough for me. If I'm the coaching staff for either one of those teams, maybe really late in the game, again, kind of like what we talked about with Jacksonville, if you happen to be way up, I could see that. But I don't know that that's any different than, any game, this weekend, if you're up by a lot and you're at the end of the season, you just don't want to get your players hurt, right? Whether you're not playing for anything or whether you are, I don't know that I necessarily see these teams as being an any additional risk is the way I would look at it.
Yeah, I mean, I can picture in my head a scenario where the 49ers are maybe sitting guys just because, again, this goes back to who is Jarrett Stidham and how good can he be.
Yeah.
If San Francisco gets a sizable lead, maybe you see that. Although, I've noticed that Kyle Shanahan has not been afraid to keep Christian McCaffrey in games where it seems like it's already decided. I know Niner fans sort of hold their breath.
He will give more of the rushing workload to a backup though, in those cases. We have seen that in this, like even last week, later in the game, Tyrion Davis-Price got involved, even though McCaffrey still coming out and working the passing downs and stuff like that. But I'm with you. Like if I were Shanahan and everything I gave up for CMC, like I would be bubble wrapping him in the fourth quarter. Sorry, fantasy managers. Look, we don't want that for you. I have CMC on some teams. I would love to see a 4-quarter performance. I would love to see a feisty performance, out of the Raiders. Enough, kind of like what you talked about with the Texans. Don't know that would happen. But to your point, like they could definitely be the one out of these two. That would be look like Minnesota. Just all bets are off. Like we never know what they're going to do. We know they'll somehow win at the end, in an improbable fashion, but like they could be down at halftime, like for all we know. That's just kind of the way the Vikings are this year. But yeah, the 49ers, they're going to be so much better than the Raiders, like at least on paper going into the game. I agree. That's probably where the higher risk is.
Yeah, the Vikings are great for TV networks because it's never over. One way or another. It's never over with the Vikings, so they are very good television watching. Let's turn our attention now to the rankings, which, as I mentioned, you can check out at fantasylife.com. Dwayne and Waz have their rankings up right now, so you can sort by whomever you choose. And starting at quarterback, and we were talking before we started this show about some of the big name guys who have let you down in the playoffs. Part of the reason I got bounced in a couple of leagues was Justin Fields. He was not the only reason. I had a number of other guys who did not perform well, but Justin Fields, who had been very hot, went into last week's game against the Bills and got you 11 rushing yards, which is not what I had foreseen. You got him as QB3 this week, which I think just based on the merits of who Justin Fields is, certainly makes a lot of sense to me. There have been some whispers that maybe the Bears ask him to tone down the running just to stay healthy for the last couple of weeks of the season. But I guess, Dwayne, we can't do rankings and projections based on whisper campaigns, right? We just have to sort of look at who Justin Fields is and the matchup and just sort of proceed from there, correct?
Right. And we also just know that because you run the ball as a quarterback doesn't even necessarily mean you're more likely to get hurt. Like it just doesn't. Like the research is out there. So now, do the coaches know this? I don't know. Sometimes I do think fantasy football, research people actually know more about certain things in the game than coaches. Like now, most of these teams do have analytic staffs at this point. And so I'm guessing hopefully those voices are in their ear. But I will say, like coming from an analytics background, I used to work for a healthcare organization, and the analytics and the data were there. Doesn't always mean that the leadership's going to listen to it. Sometimes it's especially early on, like where analytics are in the NFL, like they're becoming more accepted, but it's still early. And some coaches are reluctant, like to listen. They still want to go with their gut. Other coaches, they're early adopters, just like any industry, right? We see early adopters, we see laggers. And so what teams are the laggards? I don't know. What about the Bears coaching staff? I know nothing about them. How much do they listen to their, to their people that crunch the numbers on this kind of thing? We can't say. We know what the data says about it, but we don't know if they know. And that's really all that matters. And we don't know that they care what the data says. They could just be like, we don't care. We still think that that's bad and he could get hurt running the ball. I think a lot of Justin Fields, challenges have really come in the pocket. More so taking a lot of sacks and big hits there than it has running when he can keep things in front of him and he can make decisions about protecting his body, right? Whether that's getting out of bounds, sliding. If you're going to coach him up on something, just coach him up there. Of course, that didn't work for Washington back in the day. I remember they're like, hey, RG3, you've got to slide. Marcus, I know you were a minor league baseball player at one point. RG3 apparently never was. He does not know how to slide, so it was just a really awkward, moment when he would go to do that. Before Fields, like that's how you can protect yourself. So yeah, I have him as my QB3 this weekend. I mean, if you look at him since week 7, and ironically, this is where the Bears decided, oh, maybe we should get him into the design running game. And that's going to open up things for our running backs, everything else. since that point, when they made that decision to actually use their best player and maximize his capabilities, kind of weird that it took that long, but whatever. He's averaged 26.2 points per game. Like that's including the dud last weekend. So you're facing the Lions. Last time he saw the Lions, he scored 40.4 points. He had 147 yards and
Wow.
2 rushing touchdowns. Now, it's going to be tough to duplicate that. And the Lions are going to be obviously looking at everything the Bills did, and they remember this.
Mhm.
So I don't expect that kind of rushing production, but he's one of what? 2, 3 quarterbacks that you can go into every game saying, "Hey, 100 yards rushing is on the table." And if he gets that, he's most likely scoring a touchdown as well. You also know that a 50-yard romp for a touchdown is on the table every game. Like he's
Right.
the only quarterback, honestly, this year that's been able to do that because Lamar Jackson hasn't been healthy. Josh Allen, yeah, he can run. He's not taking off. He's not the threat to go to the house every time like what we see with Fields. Hurts is similar, more in the Josh Allen vein, like really good runner, tough guy, hard to bring down, scores touchdowns, but doesn't have the wheels, right, that Justin Fields has. So just knowing all the things you have going for you, you've got the matchup. This is the highest game total of the week, so we're
Mm.
expecting a lot of points. I couldn't find a way to get him out of my top 3. Like I thought about it. I'm like, okay, Burrow, no, can't do it. Looked
Mhm.
at, just kept going down the list. There was just no way to do it. I couldn't do anything outside of, Mahomes and Josh Allen I have above him. But
Well,
outside of that, there just wasn't a way.
and the other part is this game gets to be indoors this week too. Or last week they were in a very cold, very windy Soldier Field. They'll be in a much more climate-friendly Ford Field this week for this one too, for whatever that's worth. I know we sometimes overrate weather, but you know what? There's something to be said for not having your hands freezing every time you step out on the field. That's just me. Geno Smith, who's been so good for us all year long, has hit a bit of a slump here in the last few weeks. Some of it may have to do with not having Tyler Lockett. We'll see when Lockett's able to get back, but you've got him as the QB 15. It's like I said, he's slumping, and now he's got that Jet secondary that he's got to deal with. It just seems like a very scary sort of situation for anybody maybe starting Geno Smith this week.
Yeah, I mean, and you pretty much summarized it. Like the Jets are one of the other defenses from a passing game standpoint that we really do care about. They're the number 3 graded PFF coverage unit, 85.5. You mentioned Tyler Lockett. Pete Carroll, of course, is going to tell us that he's going to play. Chris Carson could also play this weekend if you listen to Pete Carroll. But he went through a walkthrough yesterday. Walkthrough doesn't really mean much, so we'll have to wait and see what information we get as the week goes forward with Tyler Lockett. But I don't think you're getting Tyler Lockett at 100% no matter what.
Mhm.
And when you've got an issue with your finger, your hand, and you're a receiver, like that can be problematic. It's just going to be a challenge. It's even if Lockett's out there and he's like 90%, it's going to be a challenge against the Jets defense. They're really good. And Geno's just really been on a downward trend, like you mentioned, for the last couple of weeks. So I think he's a guy that, while he's been great for us because he's come through when Tom Brady couldn't, he's come through when Aaron Rodgers couldn't, he's come through when Matt Stafford, like, I don't even need to keep going, like all these quarterbacks that have busted out if you didn't have one of the top ones. Geno's been maybe the best replacement for them. Now,
Yeah.
Trevor Lawrence has come on here lately and kind of probably taken over that mantle. But up until 2 or 3 weeks ago, like Geno had been the perfect replacement if you had missed on quarterback. But right now, it's just not good. And I would find a way to bench him if I've got, an option that, you can go check out my rankings. You mentioned he's at QB 15, so there's 14 ahead of him.
Yeah, I would say that when people are doing their year-end lists and you start talking about waiver wire pickups of the year, Geno Smith I think will be heavily involved in a lot of those conversations because he has been that good, even if the last few games have not been maybe what we saw earlier in the season. Over to running backs. Before the season started, I came up with the phrase the Saquonaissance because I really believe that Saquon Barkley was going to have a comeback season this year, and that has been the case. In the last couple of weeks, he's been very good, over 80 yards and a touchdown. He's had more than 20 points in each of the last 2 games, and has an amazing matchup this week. Not only is it a big game for the Giants, Dwayne, because they got to keep winning to make sure they stay in the playoffs. But they have the Colts, who you want to talk about teams with nothing to play for at this point. The Colts have been just abysmal the last few weeks. This just seems like it's all set up for Saquon to have a huge day.
Yeah, everything aligns. This is one of those smash plays, right? We have the criteria that all has to line up for you to get the smash designation in any week. Some weeks there's more than others, but Saquon's definitely on the list this week. Some of the things you already mentioned, 3 top 8 finishes in the last 3 healthy games. Remember, week 14, he only played 31% of the snaps. People look at that, 6.8 points in a PPR. He got hurt that week. He had the neck injury. Comes back week 15, scores 23 points. Week 16, 27.3 in a PPR. So from a trend standpoint, he's looking really good. He's playing efficiently. He leads all NFL running backs in snap share at 80% and route participation, 62%. So Saquon is definitely right. Like, he is the key to the Giants offense. He gets more opportunity than anyone else. He sits 4th in the NFL in rushing attempt share, 69%, and 3rd in target share, 17%. So that's the other added thing you get with Barkley. Because he can catch the ball, because he's always in a route, it doesn't matter really what happens in the game. If the Giants are ahead, he's getting his touches. If the Giants are behind, he's still going to get his touches, and sometimes they can become even more valuable because they are in the receiving game. So the Colts allow the fifth most rushing attempts per game at 29.6 in non-overtime play. The Giants are 6-point favorites. They can go to the playoffs if they win this game. Like, it's a slam dunk this weekend for Saquon.
Yeah, I just, I don't think we have to convince people really hard to try to put Saquon in their lineups, but for whatever reason, if you were wavering, there's very little reason to do that. James Conner. Now, you talk about defenses and maybe being wary of the outliers, or paying attention to the outliers, I guess, worried about the teams that are on the high end, attacking the teams on the low end. So I will say that when Trace McSorley was announced to start, my fear was that the Bucs were going to do everything they can to slow down James Conner, make McSorley beat them. But it turns out that the Bucs defense very much sits in that valley, kind of in the middle there, with all the majority of the teams. And James Conner ended up having a pretty good day, so I sort of learned my lesson with that one a little bit. You got Conner as a top 6 running back. Colt McCoy's coming back, which helps a little bit. But what else is it that you're seeing about James Conner that you love this week?
Well, I mean, number one, he is the number 5 non-quarterback in fantasy points over the last 4 weeks.
Wow.
So all the names we can think of and you can throw out there, and as bad as the Cardinals have been over the last few weeks, James Conner is number 5. And he's the perfect example of why utilization really matters. Now, he has an above average NFL talent profile. It's not great though, but he seems to come through, whenever you give him the touches. And for running backs, that's typically, the case. If you're going to get the carries, even if you're not that good, like, it's just, you're automatically going to get fantasy points. And so he's an above average talent, plus he's getting all that workload. And that's really what's happening. He's the uncontested number 1, like, on the team. Listen to these snaps over weeks 12, 14, 15, and 16. They had that week 13 bye. 97%, 95%, 91%, 96%. Like, he never leaves the field ever. Like, so it's just really hard for him to not come through. He could have an inefficient weekend and you still know that his floor is going to be 12 to 15. If he scores a touchdown, you're getting 20 plus. If he somehow scores 2 touchdowns, you got a shot at a 30-point game. So we do think we're going to have Colt McCoy. Actually, we know that we're going to have Colt McCoy back as the starter this weekend. I know that may not. Dude, come on, Colt McCoy. Are you kidding? Did you guys see Trace McSorley? Okay, Colt McCoy can at least make the offense functional. So I like him. It's Atlanta this weekend. That's the 5th worst PFF run defense, with a grade of 52.4. They give up 133 yards on the ground per game in non-overtime play. So you just have a lot lining up for Conner. And RB, I don't think, having him ranked this high is really, a stretch. But I think there's a lot of guys like that you should consider starting Conner over. Like, I've got him over Josh Jacobs this weekend. I'd play him over Tony Pollard with the thigh issue. Definitely playing him over Nick Chubb, Joe Mixon, all those names easily. I've got him just behind Ramondre. I think you could easily make the case that you start him over Ramondre. Ramondre is, kind of been a little bit of an enigma for us the last 2 games. Came into the one game hurt, and we're like, well, we may not see him much, and a lot of people benched him, and he just goes nuts. The next week, he didn't practice much, but clearly he's healthy. Did you guys see him the last game? And he does nothing. So we don't know for sure where Ramondre sits. We like him, but we don't know about the ankle really, where he's at with all that. So I don't have very many guys ahead of James Conner this weekend.
All right. So James Conner in play. It's somebody we can count on in Arizona, just because the rest of the offense has been, that's kind of that's my best description of the offense recently for the Cardinals. We talked about the Jaguars at the top of the show, but Travis Etienne, I won't belabor the point. He's got the Texans, so if there's anything that helps him kind of get healthy again, fantasy wise, I got to feel like it's the matchup this weekend that kind of helps Travis Etienne get back on the right side of things.
Yeah, we can just move forward. This is the weekly one we get to where Marcus, you just tell me, Dwayne, is there really anything else? I mean, he's playing the Texans. Like, no, there's not anything else. I mean, he's averaging 21 opportunities per game over the last 3 weeks. So when you do that, and now you're going to get to play against Houston, like that's enough. Like the math is done. The math is
Right.
through. Like we know to start Travis Etienne. So I've got him ranked, inside. I may move him up a little bit because when I originally wrote this yesterday, there was still a chance, right, that we may not see them. And as soon as I finished, Peterson came out and said, we're going to see him, they're going to treat this game normally. But he'd probably move up like one spot, but he's already in my top 8.
All right, so he's in the top 8 there. Kenneth Walker, you've got as a high-end RB2. I know you downgraded Geno Smith because of the matchup. Look, the Jets are good defensively, and I'm sure Elliot Christ, who's producing the show today, is smiling ear to ear as we talk about how wonderful this Jets defense is. But Kenneth Walker, you got him high-end RB2. He's another guy though who there's really no competition. I mean, when he's been healthy, he's been the guy back there, and I think for us, fantasy-wise, that's really all you can ask, regardless of who the matchup is.
Yeah, that's the main thing. Over the last 2 games, 92% of the rushing attempts and 90% of the rushing attempts. So for better or for worse, however the game script goes, most of the carries are going to go to Kenneth Walker. The Jets are pretty good against the run as well. I don't fear them the way I do against, the pass though. The passing game, they are really tough. They're kind of like the Broncos. You could end up running the ball for over 100 yards on the Jets and on the Broncos. Throwing the ball for over 250 against those two teams is like really tough. Throwing for multiple touchdowns against those two teams, really tough. But for a guy like Kenneth Walker, and honestly, like if the Seahawks want to go in to this game having any chance to beat the Jets, like I think they have to get the run game going. They need to have balance. They need to get play action really going. They need to create some chunk plays in the running game. And Walker hopefully is getting closer to health. Pete Carroll did come out last week and yesterday and say, look, we're just not practicing him. And we kind of already figured this out. Like after seeing these last 2 games, the way that the practice reports went, they're not practicing him just to manage it. Right. And they just want him to be as healthy as he can be for the games. We haven't seen quite the same explosiveness from Walker that we saw earlier in the season. The lateral agility is still there, but like that ability to like make that first move, just plant your foot in the ground and be like gone. Like, he kind of turns on like this, I don't know, like slithers maybe is the best word. Like once he really gets going, like he can make these great side to side jukes, but it's fun. He just winds his way through the defense. It's just watching Kenneth Walker play when he is healthy. It's a beautiful sight, and for you dynasty players, you should also be encouraged because like the targets per route run, all those sort of things are much better than what people were projecting because he was not used in the passing game in college. Now they still have a passing down back. Last week it was DJ Dallas. Typically it's Travis Homer. That's neither here nor there. The bigger point being that I do think that Walker can eventually turn into an every down back. Now I don't know that the staff will ever do that, but I do think he's flashed the talent profile to say that that's available. But in the end, for this week, the main thing we care about is like, look, he's getting 90% of the rushing attempts. So whether that means the game, if they're behind, and they're trailing the whole time, that might mean 14 to 15 carries. If the game is close or they're ahead, it could mean 25. So there's a wide enough range of outcomes there for Walker, and the high end looks really good that I do like him as a high end RB2.
Side note to this, the Seahawks done a pretty good job with running backs over the last few years. I mean,
Yeah,
they had all those years with Marshawn Lynch, obviously, but then to go from Chris Carson to Rashad Penny, who unfortunately just has struggled to stay healthy, to Kenneth Walker, they've done a very good job putting good running backs back there in their backfield recently. Speaking of which, got a handful here that we can just sort of rip through quickly, kind of low-end RB2s that might be especially good plays if you're playing DFS this weekend. So we'll just kind of bang through these and I'll get your thoughts. Cam Akers, who has been red hot recently and now gets the Chargers. This seems to be lining up for another big Cam Akers week.
Yeah, it's he's kind of similar to Walker. Doesn't get the passing game work or the passing downs, but they are throwing the ball to him on early downs, which is nice. Because they don't have anyone else. And he's getting over 70% of the rushing attempts. And if they have a chance to score, it's going to be Cam Akers. They've pretty much made that known. You play the Chargers. They're the 4th worst PFF run defense. 35.8 is the grade. So, yeah, Akers looking good.
Yeah, Miles Sanders. Now I wonder if Miles Sanders gets more touches. I know Jalen Hurts is trying to play, but I wonder if they take it easy on him with that shoulder. Either way, he's got the Saints, who have been not so great against the run, and 5,900 on DraftKings. Not a bad deal there, I think, for Sanders.
Yeah, and Sanders, these are all great guys to think about for DFS. I think like at a macro level, and I haven't looked at rostership yet for these guys. It's a week where you don't need to pay up at running back. There's too many mixtures here of guys that if the game script goes the right way, they could just absolutely blow up for top end RB1 numbers, and you don't need to spend, the 8,500, the 9K on the top guys. All the guys that we're talking about here are 6K or less, and most of them are in the mid 5Ks. So I definitely like the idea of Miles Sanders because he's that classic boom bust guy. Like, we get it. He could score 3 points, but when it goes right for Miles Sanders, we had 2 games out of his last 4. He's rushed for over 140 yards. So that the upside's there, the big plays are there. You've got a great offensive line. So yeah, I like Miles Sanders. And suddenly, to your point, the Saints run defense, which has really been tough over the last 3 seasons, not so much this year.
Yeah, it's just it's really kind of fallen apart. Tyler Algier, we talked about him earlier in the week. The Falcons out of the playoff race, maybe turning to some younger guys. On top of it, he's got the Cardinals, which seems like another pretty good smash spot for him.
Yeah, absolutely. Algier 17.5 attempts per game over the last 2 contests. The utilization just really, all matches up, like the snaps, the route participation, the rushing attempts. Like, he's really taken over the lead role. Cordarrelle Patterson's still involved. Like, Cordarrelle Patterson's still going to see 30 to 40% of the work. But we have a team with the Falcons that they're more dedicated than anyone to running the ball. They are very dedicated. And we just haven't seen a game, honestly, this year where we've seen Arthur Smith just pushed off of the idea that he wants to keep pounding the rock. And so that gives you insulation that some of these other guys do not. Because no matter which way the game script goes, Tyler Algier is going to have a chance to score fantasy points. If it goes really well, then he could be he could score like a high-end RB1 this weekend. And the matchup is there against the Cardinals. It should be a close game. I don't see either team running away with this one. But they're the 8th worst PFF run defense at a grade of 50.1. So I do like Tyler Algier this weekend, and he is cheap over on DraftKings.
Yeah, I remember, in fact, earlier in the week when we talked about it, you just made the point, like, come hell or high water, Arthur Smith's going to run the football. It doesn't matter what the score is, he's going to run the football.
And 5,300, man. 5,300, I have him as my RB20, but he has upside to be an RB1. Heck, I mean, he was an RB11 and RB12 over the last 2 games. So, I mean, he's already been an RB1 the last 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So 5,300 is that's too low.
Well, take advantage, everybody. Go jump in there while it's still like that. Brian Robinson, who has been a lot more efficient running the football the last few weeks. You can sort of throw out that 49er game because nobody's been efficient running the football against them this year. But before that, he was looking a lot better. Now he's getting the Browns. He's rounding into shape, I think, as far as rookie running backs go, and now has a good opportunity this week against Cleveland.
Yeah, and he's averaging 17.2 rushing attempts per game since coming back from from the knee injury, the gunshot wound. Mm-hmm. So, that's a lot. 17.2 rushing attempts per game. Last week he had 22 carries with Gibson picking up an injury in the game. Gibson is questionable this week. It was so funny. Ron Rivera comes out and he wouldn't tell the media what the injury was. He just says he's got a sprain. They're like, knee sprain, foot sprain, you know what? No, not telling you. He's got a sprain. Officially listed as a DNP with a knee on the practice report. So you can do the math on that one. My guess is he's got some sort of a knee sprain that he's dealing with here, but he had a foot issue previously. This guy's had a lot of problems with his lower body over the course of his career. So that opens up additional upside for Robinson. If for some reason Gibson needs to be in a lesser role or he is not going to play, that means that you've really got Jonathan Williams could be available to steal a few carries. He did last week, but that puts Robinson, in a spot where he could get 20 to 25 touches if that happens. Even if Gibson is available, he has an upside to hit 20 touches. You've got a great matchup, this weekend. If you look at the run defense grade is a 33.5. It's this is a good spot for Robinson. So I like him as an RB2 with RB1 spike potential.
All right, so Robinson in play. Zach Moss, another guy who has stepped in the absence of Jonathan Taylor, and I've liked him the last couple of weeks. Last week, I I really thought he was going to get more opportunities against the Chargers because it just made sense. And for whatever reason, the Colts decided they were going to make it the Nick Foles show, and that show didn't go very well. So maybe Jeff Saturday and his staff have learned something. Maybe this week they don't let Nick Foles stand back there and just get hammered behind a bad offensive line. Maybe we can see Zach Moss get some run against the Giants this week.
Yeah, I mean, and most people are going to fade Moss just because they may have tried to go to him last week and he didn't come through. But like the utilization is there. Over the last 2 games, he's had 67% and 69% of the snaps. Rushing attempts 57% and 80%. Route participation is nearly at 50%. He gets all of the short down and distance work. That means if they're inside the 5, have a chance to score touchdowns. Probably going to be Zach Moss getting those opportunities. And he's not leaving the field on the long down and distance stuff. So he's had 67% and 62% of the work whenever you know it's basically a pass situation. And in the 2-minute offense last week, he took 50% of the snaps. So it wasn't Deion Jackson coming on the field. This is basically, it's not Saquon. It's not a Saquonaissance, Marcus, but it's like just the tier below that. Like most running backs, when you see this utilization profile, you're like, that's an RB1. Now he plays on a bad team. So I would call it more of an RB2, but he definitely could score like an RB1 because he's getting all the work. We just need, the Colts to manage to hang in a game. The matchup's not bad. So I like Moss this weekend. I don't think many people are going to be on him. And he's only 5,400 on DraftKings.
Yeah, I said coming in, like once Jonathan Taylor got hurt, that he could sneakily be a big part of fantasy playoff teams. It hasn't quite worked out that way, but I think the usage and the matchups favor him. Maybe one of these times it'll come through. We'll see. Last one for this. His mom calls him Zonovan. We call him Bam. Whatever you call him, Mr. Knight. Going against the Seahawks defense that has struggled to stop the run all year long. Mike White is back, which lifts everybody's boat in that Jets offense. So Zonovan Knight very much in play, I feel like, this week.
Yeah, and he's another one that really his utilization hasn't changed. He's getting the bulk of the early down work. He just needs the right matchup. He needs the Jets to hang in the game. Like if you go over to our game hub right now, I believe the 2 picks that are in there are for the Jets covering like the 1.5 points. I'm sure Elliot, is going to shake his head. Yes, producing this show, he would approve of that. One of those bets might be Elliot. If not, he's probably going to go make the 3rd bet on the Jets right now. So I think the game script could work out. And you mentioned it. It's just a great matchup against the Seahawks defense. So Zonovan Knight, he's just a guy that no one's going to think about. And he's 5,100 on DK. So think of all these are all potential 20 touchbacks in nice matchups that are all 6K or less. Like you just don't get this that often most of the time. So this is one of those scenarios where the pricing just doesn't adjust on a 1-week basis enough to account for how much game script matters for these backs that we're talking about. And all of them are in positive spots. So that would be my big takeaway from this discussion we've just had. If you're going to play DFS this weekend, and you can use this obviously for your lineups, and we'll talk about some guys we might bench here in a minute. But there's no need to spend up, in my opinion. Now, I haven't seen rostership, so if I went and looked, a couple of these guys might be projected to be 30-40% rostered. If that's the case, like just fade those 2, just play the ones that nobody else is going to play.
There it is. I'm curious to see what Cam Akers' rostership is going to be after we pretty much avoided him all year long, and now he's gotten hot late in the season. So I'm curious to see how many folks might be on him.
He's probably the one. Like I don't know, I haven't looked at it, but yeah, like he's done it enough now that just. People are going to feel more comfortable clicking on him, if you will.
Right.
Like it just, once that happens, it usually means it's bad. It's kind of like, when your neighbors start talking about like, Bitcoin and stuff, like it's time to get out. Like once everybody's talking about it, once my wife's a hairstylist. So that's kind of how I know like when an investment it's time to bail. Like if she comes home and starts talking about it, and that means all of her clients are talking about it, it means it's probably over. So hopefully this isn't true with Cam Akers, but I feel like this could be that kind of weekend for him.
That the Cam Akers train ride might be coming to an end here. We'll see. Let's look at some wide receivers, and we just talked about Bam Knight. Let's talk about Garrett Wilson because again, Mike White is back. I feel like that's pretty much the only analysis I need to give for Jets wide receivers. Mike White is back. The rest of it we'll figure out as we go along. But Garrett Wilson back in play. You got him as a top 10 receiver this week.
Yeah. Like, I know Elliott's producing today. I didn't do this just for him. But we're talking a lot about the Jets. But yeah, looking at Garrett Wilson, he's in, if you look at the 6 games without Zach Wilson, so without his namesake, without the other Wilson, It's been really good, man. And so folks, like, you just go check it out over on Fantasy Life. You'll see I chart out all the data for you. And you'll see it's weeks 1, 2, 3, and 12, 13, and 14, where he has not had Zach Wilson. Here are his fantasy points: 9.2, 30, 12, 26.4, 24.2, 13.8. So it's pretty straightforward. When you don't have Zach Wilson under center, it's going to be really good for Garrett Wilson. I'm going to see plenty of the he's the clear lead option, averaging 19.3 fantasy points per game when he has Mike White or Joe Flacco. That he upgrades to. I have him as a low end wide receiver 1 this weekend. Like, so he's an absolute smash play. I want to get him into every lineup I can. Most start sit questions you give me with the name Garrett Wilson as one of the choices, I'm naming Garrett Wilson.
So I'm curious to see how this plays out at the end of the year, because right now he very well could be the fantasy rookie of the year. I think there were some other guys that were sort of in the running. Unfortunately, Breece Hall got hurt, but what Garrett Wilson has done has been incredible. And really, football wise, I think is a reason for Jets fans to be very excited about what the future is. Jerry Jeudy. You got him a wide receiver 20 and really has stepped up in the latter part of the season. It doesn't matter what the struggles of the Broncos offense have been as a whole. Jerry Jeudy has shown up and is making plays. I know he's dealing with a little bit of an ankle injury, I believe it is this week.
Yeah.
So that's something to keep an eye on. But at least in terms of how he's being used and how much they're going to him, he's kind of blossomed into the guy we thought he could be when he was drafted.
Yeah, the ankle injury is something that he's been battling. It actually is what kept him out of some contests earlier this season. He aggravated it, I guess, in practice. He did return to practice yesterday, though, so that's a good sign. He went in with the trainers, maybe probably just got it taped back up, something like that. But he did return, so that's a positive. We do need to keep an eye on it. To your point, let's see what practices look like today. And with Jeudy, like, the thing that I'm seeing, Marcus, like, he's a guy that I went back and I've watched a lot of it. Because I was just interested, and that's how I typically approach it. We can't watch every play of every player. Like, I use the utilization, I look at it, and then, like, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna go look at this. Like, I want to go watch this guy because he's on a tear. Like, so over his last 6 healthy games, here are his target shares: 30%, 25%, 29%, 23%, 32%, 31%. I get it. What is 30% worth with Russell Wilson? You're right. It's not a high end wide receiver 1. It could be that, though, potentially somewhere else. So looking at him over the stretch, a 78.4 PFF receiving grade, 2.15 yards per route run. Like, so if you're in Dynasty, like, you should be super excited. Like, Jerry Jeudy does, he's doing some really solid things. The other thing that I'll mention, Marcus, is he's doing this working outside. He's really he was protected early in the season, playing mostly from the slot. And that can be a limiter as far as, like, if he hits free agency. It's not, obviously that's not happening this next year. We'll see what the Broncos will probably pick up as 5th year option. He's going into this is his 3rd year. He'll be going into his 4th year with the team. Former 1st round pick out of Alabama, but he's doing all the things you want to see. Like, he's showing that he can win outside, he can play inside, he's playing better after the catch. So I do think health has been a lot of the factor for Jerry Jeudy. So over this stretch, he's been wide receiver 15, 16, 14, wide receiver 2, wide receiver 22, wide receiver 15. That wide receiver 2 finish was against the Kansas City Chiefs. His matchup this weekend, the last time he played them, he had 8 receptions, 73 yards, and 3 touchdowns. We know the Chiefs are big favorites here. The Broncos are going to need to throw the ball. And I just feel that Judy's clearly separated from Sutton. Now, some of the games I gave you where he had those huge target shares were without Sutton. Last week, though, we had Sutton back, and he was still a 31% target share earner. I do think that Jerry Jeudy's proving that he can earn targets. He's not a guy you just got to throw it up to. He can create separation. I do think it's funny. Have you seen some of these videos people have put on YouTube? Sam Monson's one of the main ones that I saw of, like, the of the wide receivers for the Broncos, like, just like basically throwing temper tantrums because Russ Wilson doesn't see them open. I mean, they're just on the field, like, just throwing their hands, like, dude, what are you looking at? And it's funny, one of the plays at Sutton, he's rolling his way, and Sutton's like right here, and no one's on him, and Russ Wilson's like looking back this way, and he's like over there, like he's just like a bait. I'm surprised he didn't just fall on the ground and start rolling around. Looks like something like a child would do. But Jeudy himself looks really good. I have him as a low-end wide receiver 2, but he's got upside this weekend.
All right, so Jerry Jeudy back in play. By the way, you mentioned that game against the Chiefs. He was lucky to not be ejected from that game because
Yes.
he had a temper tantrum where he collided with a ref, and
Yeah.
was very fortunate to not get ejected. Then he turns around, he catches 3 touchdowns. So we'll see if he can do the 3 touchdown part and maybe avoid the nearly getting ejected part. Drake London has really come on the last couple of weeks. Oh, look, all it took was Kyle Pitts getting hurt, Marcus Mariota getting benched, and the Falcons falling out of playoff contention for them to finally start throwing to their big time rookie wide receiver. But whatever, however it happens, I'm glad it happens. And hopefully it keeps rolling this week against Arizona. This is something that I think was a long time coming, and I'm glad it finally got here.
Yeah, I agree. And all of the underlying data for Drake London has been very positive. We've talked about him a lot on the show. It's just been more a function of a team that wants to run all the time. That's a positive for a guy we talked about earlier in Tyler Algier. It was a negative if you're trying to support two weapons in the passing game when your quarterback, on top of not throwing it often, also is not very good at throwing it. Now, Desmond Ridder last game did get over the 200-yard mark. His first start wasn't as good. And London, to your point, he's just getting everything. He's had 12, 11, and 9 targets over the last 3 games. Remember, they lost Kyle Pitts in week 11, to your point. So it's just really his show now. You're playing against the Cardinals. They give up the 8th most receiving yards per game in non-overtime with 250 per game. So I've got him as a low-end wide receiver, too.
Oh, Drake London. I just like seeing it because before the season, I had him pegged as the top rookie receiver in fantasy. And I don't blame me. I blame Arthur Smith for why that hasn't worked out.
I think that's fair. Actually, that's very fair. Yes.
Like I had my process, I had everything down. It just didn't work out, and I don't think it was my fault. One tight end to talk about, that's Dalton Schultz. Another guy who I feel like the process on him has been right, even if the results haven't worked out. And it's like I love the matchups. I like the fact that he's on the field a lot. He's finding targets. And then like Peyton Hendershot comes out of nowhere and scores a touchdown, that sort of thing. But I know you've got him as tight end 6. I'm willing to go back to the well one more time this week. Hopefully this works out with Dalton Schultz.
Yeah, with Schultz, look, it's been a weird year. Early in the season, he hurt his MCL. He wasn't getting to play the full complement of snaps. The Cowboys were basically just trying to give him plays off, and we would see him, with, route participations in like the 50%, 60% range. But he would have these huge targets per route run games. And so his target shares would still come out fine. Well, now over the last 4 weeks, we've seen he's healthy, route participation of 91%, 88%, 89%, 87%, playing a ton. Like if you're over 80% route participation and you get a targets per route run of 18, 19% plus, typically you're just a top 12 tight end historically, going back to 2011. Just it's a slam dunk. But with Schultz, like we just haven't seen it over the last several games. Just kind of gone sideways on him. He's had 5.3 fantasy points, 14.7. That was fine in week 14, but then 3.5 in week 15. Last week, 7.3. 7.3, some people were probably like, we'll take it at tight end.
Right.
7.3, we'll take it. We're not going to complain. But he's really due. Like his route participation, he plays with a good quarterback. He plays in an offense that can score. We've seen him earn the targets earlier this season. We just haven't had that game. He's a combustible kind of player, in my opinion. Like because we haven't seen where when those two things have mixed, he's had that explosion game yet. But he's totally due for it. This could be a guy that could easily finish as the QB. I mean, the QB1. That would be really
that would be amazing. Right?
One. I'm thinking of Taysom Hill, I guess. Yeah, but Schultz could come through as the tight end 1 on the slate. Like, look, obviously we're going to rank Kelsey, we're going to rank Kittle above him. Those guys are going to be up there. But like it just everything's there. The perfect mix just hasn't happened yet. And so when it does, like it's just going to be a huge game for him eventually, and it could be this weekend.
Hopefully it is this weekend for a lot of fantasy managers out there. That's just a quick overview. I shouldn't say quick, but it's an overview of what you can find over at the rankings there at fantasylife.com. Go check it out. While you're there, go peruse the Game Hub for whatever your poison is in terms of fantasy or football viewing this weekend, whether it's fantasy, whether it's DFS, sports betting, whatever it is. The Game Hub can help you out in there. And just in case you haven't already, sign up for the newsletter. It's awesome. It is informative. It's a lot of fun. Comes to your inbox every single day, and you don't have to do a dang thing to make it happen except sign up. As we get ready to wrap up this show, there are a lot of tough decisions that people are going to have to make with their lineups here in championship weekend. And we've reached a point where a lot of big name players maybe aren't living up to their reputations in terms of what they're giving you fantasy wise. And so we were talking about this, Dwayne, about the old refrain of start your studs, right? Here it is. This is a game for all the marbles in your league. You may have some studs that have been letting you down. Do you stick with them? Do you go somewhere else? What do you subscribe to? Is it a start your studs, or do you sort of look at players individually now?
Yeah, I do look at them individually. I think there are layers, right, to this conversation. But like when you have multiple factors going against a player, I do think it really matters. So like Josh Jacobs, is a good example. You've got a really tough matchup against the 49ers. You've got a quarterback change to go with Jared Stidham. You and I both talked about it. Like he's going to be lucky to score a touchdown this weekend. So what's the ceiling really of Josh Jacobs? I think his floor is obviously lower, but like if you're just playing for a floor, he could probably still give you 10 points.
Mhm.
But like the chance of Josh Jacobs going off for 35 this weekend and you being like, "Oh my God, I benched Josh Jacobs." It's not what it was 3 weeks ago. And you obviously would never do that then. So I think with him, you could entertain it. Now it still has to be for the right name. Like who are you talking about? Like, so if someone asked me, Josh Jacobs or Travis Etienne this weekend, Travis Etienne.
Yeah,
Josh Jacobs or James Conner this weekend, James Conner.
James Conner.
Josh
Mhm.
Jacobs, Ramondre Stevenson, going Ramondre Stevenson. Dalvin Cook, going Dalvin Cook. Tony Pollard, a little closer because he's dealing with a thigh injury, but I would start all those guys over Josh Jacobs, and I would not blink because of all the factors aligning against Jacobs. Now, here's where it gets tricky. And you tell me, like, would you start any of these guys over Josh Jacobs, right? So, I mean, you talk about David Montgomery. He plays against Detroit this weekend. Probably going to get maybe the same number of carries and touches as Josh Jacobs and a better game script. Cam Akers, who we've talked about, against the Chargers. Miles Sanders, we've talked about, you know what? His floor could be bad, maybe slightly lower than Jacobs, but his ceiling is higher than Jacobs this weekend.
Mhm.
It's higher. So if you're going for all the like some of this starts to also depend on your matchup. Like if you're looking at your matchup and you're like, oh my God, I'm playing against the best team in the league. Who knows what that even is? Like, by the way, right now, the best team in your league 3 weeks ago is not the best team in your fantasy league this weekend. I promise you, because a lot of that guy probably has Josh Jacobs. So you're probably on the other side of the conversation. But if you're looking at it from that lens, like I start to entertain it, and you don't want to change. It's not just because we're in fantasy championship weekend. You don't want to change your strategy and your process. However, like this is something that I would think about more just overall period when you think about start your studs, versus some of the other options that are available. So I think on a guy like Jacobs, I am willing to once you line it all out. But what do you think?
No, I think Jacobs is one where it gets. I would say if it were still Derek Carr, I would feel a lot better about it. But with
Yeah.
Jared Stidham, I feel that makes it easy to kind of get away from Josh Jacobs. And I saw there's obviously the discussion on Twitter after the Raiders announced that they were benching Derek Carr, and I saw more than a few people saying, "What does it matter? You're going to start these guys anyway, no questions asked." And I was kind of like, I feel like there are at least going to be questions asked. Like maybe in the end you decide to start them, but I don't think you just blindly plug them in just because of what they've done all year. So I think Josh Jacobs is one you can get away from. I definitely feel that way about Amari Cooper. Mike Evans, a couple of wide receivers who have not really had good games lately. We talked earlier in the week. It just felt like Cooper and Deshaun Watson are still learning to work together a little bit. And Mike Evans is a situation where it just feels like the Bucs can't get him the ball consistently. These are two guys I would very much entertain getting away from this week.
Absolutely. So Garrett Wilson is a name that I would bench them both for easily. I've got Garrett Wilson as my wide receiver 10. I would bench them for Christian Watson if he was active. He didn't practice yesterday with the hip injury. We want to hear a full practice report, but he's playing against Minnesota this weekend. We'll see what happens there. I'm trying to name some names that, hadn't necessarily been at the top of the leaderboard early in the season. Jerry Jeudy,
Mhm.
I would start, right, over Amari Cooper. I would start him over Mike Evans easily. I would start DJ Moore this weekend, even
Ooh.
against Tampa Bay. Like he's been a
Mhm.
little bit better with Sam Darnold over the last
Yeah.
few weeks. I would start Zay Jones over both of these guys. Why? What are you hoping for with Mike Evans? You're just hoping, God, Mike Evans, he's got a high ceiling. Okay, well, we've seen Zay Jones' ceiling. He can catch 3 touchdowns.
Right.
So I like all of these guys above Amari Cooper, above Mike Evans. It starts to get tighter. There are more coin flip situations. You get to Drake London. I think that's a coin flip now.
Mhm.
Drake London versus Amari Cooper and Mike Evans is a coin flip. Brandon Ayuk is a coin flip against those guys. So I think you can make a case that you would start both of those guys over Amari Cooper and Mike Evans. Now, Amari, I will say that the targets have been there. Mike Evans, they have not. So I do
Right.
treat them differently. I would actually start all the guys we just named, every one of them I would start over Mike Evans. It's not even a coin flip. Amari, it's tougher with Amari versus A. Jones, Amari versus Drake London. You just really need him and Watson to get in sync. And remember, last week, things were also depressed by the terrible conditions
Yeah.
with the wind. And
Yeah.
so I think Amari is the one that would be more likely to hurt you. Evans, I think we've seen it long enough. Brady's not going to throw into coverage. And the way NFL teams are playing, they're saying, you're not throwing to Mike Evans. We're going to make you throw to Chris Godwin. And Brady says, okay, I'm going to throw to Chris Godwin. If he's not open, I'm going to throw to my running back. So with Mike Evans, unless Carolina just has some sort of complete brain fart, like a mental lapse, and just like, oh, we're going to single up Mike Evans all game and play a single high man coverage. Like Mike Evans isn't doing anything this weekend. Like you can get him out of your lineup.
Yeah, no, and just watching that game last week against Arizona, they tried to take a couple of shots downfield, and they both came up short, and Brady got picked off a couple of times. So it's been all bad there. Last one, Mark Andrews. I feel like this one's a little bit tougher just because the state of tight end has been such a disaster this year that, you're holding on to the fact that Mark Andrews has a high ceiling. The targets have still been there for him, even if the production hasn't. This one feels like a little bit of a harder one to get away from. Maybe, I don't know, maybe you somehow have both Mark Andrews and say Evan Ingram. That's an easy one. I think if you got Evan Ingram, he's an easy start there. But beyond that, maybe a Dawson Knox this week, a Tyler Higbee, I'm not sure. But it's harder for me to find scenarios where I bench Mark Andrews.
Yeah, I agree. The main one that would be a real possibility you named, Evan Ingram.
Mm-hmm.
I would start Evan Ingram over Mark Andrews, period. Just because, Trevor Lawrence is just a really good quarterback. We're seeing him blossom before our eyes. The Jaguars they're playing a backup, right? That is a backup in the league. And things are not working right now for Andrews. There's something going on with his health. He's getting the targets, but nothing's happening with them. And also, his catchable pass rate, so these targets he's getting, they're not high quality. Most of them are not catchable. I shouldn't say most, but half of them have not been catchable. So one of the benefits of playing tight end, working shorter underneath areas, mismatches, linebackers, safeties, is your catch rate can go up. Well, that's just not the case right now for Andrews. So that's a problem. Dalton Schultz, I would consider it. I would consider Dalton Schultz. I would go Andrews over Goddard just because Goddard gets one of these weird things. I don't pay attention super closely to position-specific matchups. I care more, does a defense give up a lot of yards passing, and where do they give it up? In the middle of the field, the outside of the field? New Orleans is just weird. For whatever reason, tight ends can't score points against New Orleans for 20 years. It goes back a long freaking way how good New Orleans has been. A lot of people talk about Demario Davis, talk about the safety combos they've had there, they've had really good safety play over the last several years. But it's tough. It's tough, for a tight end. So probably going to lean Andrews over Goddard. But I think Evan Ingram and Dalton Schultz are the two. Evan Ingram for sure. Dalton Schultz, flip a coin.
All right. So there you go. There's the tight ends. One day tight end is going to be deep. I don't know when that day is going to be. It's not going to be.
Could have been this year. We had so many injuries. Now we say deep. You wouldn't have had the upside that you want. You still only had a few guys that had the true week-to-week upside. But losing Zach Ertz hurt. Having Goddard out for a big period of time definitely hurt. Losing Matt Stafford, that hurt Tyler Higbee. Mm-hmm. David Njoku's been in and out of the lineup. Waller has been hurt. There's a lot of injuries. Now, you can also argue that tight ends, they're kind of like running backs. They get hurt a lot. People, when DBs come in and tackle these guys, they're not going after a shoulder pad. They are going straight at their knees, their feet, their ankles. They're going for the lowest part of the body. Mm-hmm. So these guys, they pick up a lot of injuries along the way. They also have to block a lot. It's an intense position to play.
All right, you made me feel slightly better about the position. I'm still probably going to spend an early round pick on one of the top guys just so I avoid this problem next year. But I can tell myself a story where I feel better about it when we get back to draft season next year. We're going to get back to you next week, though, with a little bit more, probably a wrap-up of Week 17 and a look ahead for those of you maniacs who are still playing in Week 18. We'll have that and plenty more. But in the meantime, we appreciate you hanging out with us as we always do. Go check out everything we have offering over at fantasylife.com. All the information you need to be smarter about the weekend. In the meantime, enjoy Week 17, everybody. Best of luck to you playing in your fantasy championships. Hopefully, you're able to bring home a crown. For Dwayne, I am Marcus. This has been the Fantasy Life Podcast. Enjoy the weekend, and we'll talk to you next week.